The air is cool above the water, and the first light of dawn lies pale on a narrow channel between tall walls of reed. Your boat moves slowly enough that you can hear the faint brushing of stems and the soft slap of water against mud. From a distance, the banks seem firm and settled, but close up they loosen into roots, silt, and mats of vegetation that drift almost without notice. This is the Danube Delta, where one of Europe's great rivers arrives at the Black Sea and gradually forgets the shape of a river. Instead of a single mouth, there are branching channels, shallow lakes, floating islands, wet meadows, and long reed beds resting on ground that is never quite finished. Nearly all of it has been made from fine sediment carried across a continent, then released here when the water finally begins to slow. That is part of what makes this place feel so strange, because the landscape is not simply there, it is still forming. Land becomes water. Water gathers plants, and plants begin to make new land in return. If you follow the current a little farther in, the delta starts to reveal how a whole world can exist in the quiet space between settling and becoming. Ahead, the channel bends so gently that the turn is almost invisible, and yet everything beyond it feels less certain. The open line of the river begins to soften there, because side passages slip away into reed shadow, and the water no longer promises a single direction. That is the first real shift in the delta, and you feel it before you can fully see it. A river is usually easy to imagine. It comes from somewhere high, moves somewhere low, and carries its story forward in one long sentence. But here, at the edge of the Black Sea, the sentence starts breaking into whispers. The current still moves, but it hesitates. It brushes one bank, then another. It leaves a little silt against a root, then a little more around a fallen stem, and because of that small delay, the shape of the place begins to change. The boatman has a map folded under one hand, though he barely looks at it. That detail matters, because in a landscape like this, a map can only describe what was true for a while. A channel deep enough last spring may already be shallower now. A mud bank that seemed fixed may have blurred at the edges. A patch of reed that looked like shoreline from a distance may turn out to be floating ground, anchored only loosely below. So there is an early choice to make. We can stay with the broad branch, where the water still behaves enough like a river to be legible, or we can follow one of the narrower cuts, where the delta begins showing its softer logic. The decision is to follow the water where it loosens. That choice is important, because the strangeness of this place is easiest to understand where the solid world becomes unreliable. The engine lowers to a gentler hum. The bow turns toward a thinner channel, one that opens between reed walls so dense that the entrance looks almost stitched together. As soon as the boat enters, the air seems to change. The breeze from the wider branch falls away. Sound narrows. Even the light is different here, filtered through seed heads and green stems, reflected upward from tea-colored water. The banks, if they can still be called banks, are no longer clean edges. They are braided layers of mud, roots, broken stalks, and trapped sediment. In places they bulge outward like land. In places they sag and tremble when touched by wake. That trembling is evidence of the central mystery. What looks like ground is often only partly ground. Below the surface, the Danube is still laying things down. The river has carried clay from distant plains, fine sand from older channels, dark organic matter from floodplains upstream, and tiny dissolved minerals from mountains far to the west. For most of its journey, the water had enough energy to keep much of that material in motion. Here, it begins to lose that energy, and because it slows, it starts to give its burden away. A grain of silt drops first where the current weakens. Then another settles into the shelter of a stem. Then a soft film of mud spreads over submerged roots. Nothing dramatic happens, but that is precisely how the delta grows. Not with a single event, but with countless moments of release. Each quiet patch of water becomes a place where the continent can come to rest. That is why the scale feels so unusual. This is one of Europe's great wetlands, yet so much of it is built from material fine enough to smear between fingers. The apparent solidity of the delta hides how recent, how provisional, and how patient its making really is. If you step ashore in some places, you are not stepping onto ancient rock. You are stepping onto an agreement between sediment, water, and plants. And like all agreements in a wetland, it can be revised. The channel narrows again. A drift of leaves presses into one side, and the boat glides around it with almost no sound. Somewhere deeper in the reeds, a bird calls once, then goes still. The stillness has its own pressure here, not heavy, but enclosing. It makes small details feel large. The pale crust of drying mud on a broken reed, the circles widening where an insect touched the surface. The way one tuft of vegetation has collected enough silt to rise a little higher than the water around it. That tuft is more than decoration. It is a beginning. In deltas, plants do not merely occupy land after it forms. Very often they help form it. A few stems slow the current. Slower current drops more suspended sediment. More sediment gives roots and rhizomes something to bind. Once that binding begins, a loose patch can thicken into a platform. The platform can trap still more material, and over time, what began as drifting vegetation may become something that behaves almost like an island. Because of that, the Danube Delta is not simply a river mouth spreading outward. It is a place where water and plant life are constantly negotiating the future shape of the ground. The boatman cuts the engine for a moment, and the silence that follows is so complete that the channel feels sealed. Without the motor, the water reveals another fact. The flow is present, but slight. You can tell by the movement of pollen, by the nearly invisible drift of green flecks along the surface, by a feather slipping under the shadow of the reeds. This reduced speed is the whole reason the delta exists. For thousands of years, the Danube has brought suspended matter here from an enormous drainage basin that reaches across much of Europe. By the time the river arrives at the low coast, the slope is faint, the water spreads. It divides, its power to carry sediment weakens. And that weakness, repeated season after season, is creative. It allows the river to stop being only a corridor and become a landscape builder. When the engine starts again, the boat moves into a wider opening where the reeds part just enough to expose a shallow lagoon. The water is darker here. A layer of cloud has moved over the rising sun, and the surface turns from silver to muted grey. Near the margins, stems emerge from low peat and mud, then give way to patches of open water where submerged plants lie just below sight. This broadening of space is another development in the delta's logic. Narrow channels hide the act of transport. Lakes and shallow basins reveal the act of settling. Here, with less current, fine particles can remain suspended for hours or days before slowly descending. If wind arrives later, they may be stirred up again, clouding the water, moving a short distance, and dropping elsewhere. So even in places that appear motionless, the bottom is being rewritten. That helps explain why the delta feels less like a finished object than like a surface under revision. Its boundaries are not only shaped by where water cuts, they are shaped by where water pauses. The distinction matters. In a mountain valley, a cliff tells a clear story of resistance. In a desert canyon, stone remembers each flood in layers and walls. But here, memory is softer. It is stored in levees only slightly raised above marsh, in old channels that now hold stagnant water, in peat beneath reed beds, in crescent lakes that were once part of a moving branch, before the river abandoned them and wandered elsewhere. The strange quality of the delta comes partly from this hidden archive. The landscape is full of former decisions made by water. Some were seasonal, some lasted centuries, none were final. We drift along the lagoon's edge, and the boatman points with two fingers to what looks at first like ordinary shoreline. Only when the bow comes near does the deception become clear. The green margin lifts slightly with the wash. It is not firm bank at all, but a floating mat of reed and peat, thick enough to carry shrubs in places. yet not fully connected to solid ground below. This is one of the delta's clearest surprises. A person raised on ordinary landscapes expects land to stay put. In the Danube Delta, even that expectation begins to loosen. Floating reed islands form when dense vegetation, intertwined roots, and accumulated organic matter create a buoyant mass. Sediment gathers in and around it. New stems root into it. The platform rises and sinks with water level, flexes under pressure, and may slowly drift or split. Seen from afar, it can look stable. Up close, it behaves like something halfway between meadow and raft. That halfway quality is everywhere here. Freshwater and sea, river and lake, mud and ground, stillness and movement. Nothing is entirely one thing. And because the categories blur, the delta can feel subtly disorienting, even when it is calm. The boat does not attempt to cross the floating margin. Instead, we follow a narrow passage that is open beside it. That choice reveals another layer of cause and effect. Where vegetation blocks the flow, water seeks easier paths. Those paths deepen slightly. As they deepen, they carry more water, at least for a while. Then, if more sediment drops or more plants gather, the path may narrow again. This is how branching wetlands evolve, not through a single stable design, but through repeated small adjustments. One channel gains prominence, another silts up. A shallow basin opens during flood season, a reed bed expands over its edge, a lake becomes marsh, marsh becomes quaking ground. Then, under changed conditions, part of it may reopen to water. The delta is strange because its map is written in eras too slow for one day, yet too quick for geology in the usual sense. It is ancient in process. The passage bends around a low embankment of sediment that seems newly formed. The mud there is dark and smooth, with a delicate crust only at the top. A line of tiny shells marks where the water stood a little higher not long ago. That mark is evidence of another quiet force, fluctuation. The delta is not shaped only by average flow, it is shaped by pulses. Spring snowmelt upstream, seasonal rains, years of heavier flooding, years of reduced discharge. When the Danube rises, water spreads farther into side basins and reed fields. It slows there. It leaves suspended matter over a wider area. As the water withdraws, it does not merely expose the old ground, it often leaves a fresh skin of mineral-rich mud. Plants colonize that surface. Roots hold it. And what was briefly floodwater begins contributing to new land. Because of that, the delta is built not just at its obvious edges, but repeatedly within itself. The interior grows by inundation. That is why following the current matters more than following a straight route on a map. Water is the only guide that explains the place honestly. It tells you where energy remains. It tells you where energy has faded. It tells you why one branch stays open while another fills. And here, in a world measured by gradients so slight that the eye can barely register them, tiny differences in speed and depth become destiny. The boat emerges from the passage into a wider reach, where the horizon opens, though not all at once. Reeds still occupy the middle distance. Beyond them, low water spreads into brightness. The sense of enclosure relaxes. Now the delta feels large in a different way. Not vertical, like mountains. Not endless, like open sea. But horizontally uncertain. A breadth of mirrors, vegetation, and hidden channels where distance is hard to judge because everything sits so low. This broader view introduces the next realization. The Danube Delta is often described as if it were a single shape at the end of a river. In truth, it is a collection of related environments, tied together by water and sediment. There are active distributary branches carrying major flow. There are natural levees built by repeated overbank deposition. There are shallow lakes with shifting clarity. There are floodplain forests on slightly higher ground. There are marshes, wet meadows, and extensive reed beds rooted in peat and mud. And beyond all of that, there are coastal ridges, lagoons, and the Black Sea itself, pushing back with waves and currents. This complexity matters because the strangeness of the delta is not limited to one visual feature. It arises from the way many gentle processes overlap. A river arriving from inland, sediment settling out, plants trapping what settles, flood pulses redistributing it, wind stirring shallow basins, the sea reworking the outer edge. No single force controls the whole. Instead, the landscape emerges from negotiation. The boatman slows again near a patch of clear water where stems thin and the surface reflects the sky almost perfectly. It is tempting to call it still, but a closer look shows motion everywhere. Bits of organic debris rotate in a weak eddy. A cloud of suspended silt hangs under the surface, denser on one side than the other. Minute ripples spread from fish just below. These details show why calm can be misleading here. What appears settled is often only temporarily balanced. That balance is enough, though, to produce extraordinary ecological richness. Because water depth changes gradually across the delta, and because different areas connect and disconnect through the seasons, many habitats can exist close together. A deep branch may shelter fish moving inland. A shallow, flooded margin may warm quickly and support spawning. A stagnant pocket rich in decaying plants may feed insects and microorganisms. A reed bed may provide cover, nesting space, and a trap for drifting sediment all at once. The system's instability creates opportunity. If the ground were fixed and dry, much of that subtle abundance would vanish. The consequence is a landscape where life depends on incompleteness. That idea begins to answer the title's question. The Danube Delta feels strange because it violates ordinary expectations about what a landscape should do. Land should hold still. Shorelines should be legible. A river should know where it is going. Here, none of those assumptions fully survive. The place keeps softening them. Even the concept of arrival becomes uncertain. Has the Danube reached the sea when it enters the delta? Has it arrived only at the mouths? Or is the entire wetland a prolonged moment of arrival, stretched across channels, lakes, and reed fields? That uncertainty gives the delta its peculiar atmosphere. It is less a destination than a gradual release. The river does not stop. It disperses. Farther ahead, the broad water narrows into another corridor, this one edged not by steep reed walls, but by lower margins where mud, sedge, and broken stalks mingle in open patches. The shift suggests a new stage in the journey. We could stay in the more navigable branch and continue toward the outer mouths. Instead, the better choice is to turn into the quieter side, water, where the process of landmaking is easier to read at close range. The reason is simple. Out on the main flow, the delta can still look like a river system with marsh on either side. In the shallower interior, that illusion breaks down. There, weeds do not merely border the water, they organize it. They partition space, they slow it, strain it, and convert loose mud into something that almost resembles architecture. As the bow enters the shallower corridor, stems begin to close around the boat again, and the surface darkens with the shadow of dense growth. The sound changes too. The broader hush of open water gives way to the dry whisper of reed leaves touching one another overhead. The air smells faintly of peat, wet cellulose, and warm mud. And just beneath the surface, unseen but decisive, the roots thicken into a hidden framework that will explain why so much of this delta seems to float between states. In the Danube Delta, those hidden roots are mostly rhizomes, long horizontal stems that travel through mud and peat, sending up new shoots wherever conditions allow. A reed bed looks simple from above, just a crowded field of vertical stalks. But below the waterline it is a woven structure, dense, springy, and surprisingly strong. Each season adds more material to it. Living roots thicken through soft sediment. Dead stems collapse and sink. Fine particles drifting in from nearby channels catch in that mesh and stay there. Then bacteria and fungi begin the quiet work of breaking old plant matter down, though not all the way, because these wet, low-oxygen soils slow decay. That slowdown matters. It means the delta does not only receive mineral sediment from the river, It also manufactures its own ground from the remains of last year's growth. Over time, that creates peat, dark and spongy, rich with partially preserved plant material. Peat is one reason this wetland can feel so uncertain underfoot. It compresses, it swells, it stores water like a memory. And in places, when it forms together with living reed roots, it becomes buoyant enough to loosen from the bottom and behave like a floating platform. That is not a poetic exaggeration. It is a mechanical fact of the delta. A mat of roots and peat can become thick enough to support new stems, sedges, even small shrubs, while still rising and falling with the water beneath it. The boatman reaches out with a pole and gently presses the edge of one such mass. The surface dips, then returns. Not much. Just enough to show that the shore is negotiating with gravity. That movement changes the way you read everything around you. A line that looked stable a moment ago now appears provisional. A clump of greenery becomes a raft with ambitions. A bank becomes a process. This is the irreversible shift in understanding that the interior reed world creates. Until now, it was still possible to imagine the delta as a river system bordered by marsh. Here, that distinction stops working. The marsh is not simply adjacent to the water, it is shaping the water, splitting it, delaying it, and in some places replacing open channels with a vegetal architecture of its own. The corridor tightens until the reed walls almost meet overhead. Light filters down in narrow strips. The water below is tea brown, colored by dissolved organic compounds released from decaying plants. That color tells another quiet story. In wetlands, chemistry is never separate from shape. As plant matter accumulates and breaks down, it changes the water around it. Oxygen often drops in the mud beneath dense vegetation because microbes consume it while decomposing organic material. Nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus cycle through the system, sometimes locked into living tissue, sometimes released back into the water, sometimes buried in sediment. These exchanges help determine which plants thrive, which microorganisms flourish, and how quickly bottom material builds. The delta's strangeness is physical, but it is also chemical. The water moving through these reed corridors is not the same water, in character, as the broader branch we left behind. It has spent more time in contact with stems, roots, mud, and decomposing litter. It is slower, warmer in shallow places, often more colored, sometimes lower in oxygen near the bottom. Those differences create micro-worlds. A fish entering from a distributary branch is not merely swimming into narrower space. It is moving into a distinct environment, one with different shelter, food, and water conditions. A bird landing here is not just landing in vegetation. It is entering a machine that stores sediment and rewrites the ground. The boat slows to almost nothing where fallen reeds have created a low barrier across part of the passage. Some stems are fresh and green, others are pale and dry, bent from last season's growth. The boatman does not force through them. Instead, he guides the bow toward a side opening where the water is slightly darker. That is a small decision, but it reveals how movement in the delta is often guided by what plants permit. In dry landscapes, roads are cut through resistance. Here, routes persist only where water remains just energetic enough to hold them open. The reeds are engineers of friction. They take momentum out of the system. A channel entering dense growth slows. As it slows, it drops more suspended sediment. As the bottom rises, stems gain a better foothold. As stem density increases, flow weakens further. Eventually, what was once a navigable path can become marsh. This is one of the core mechanisms by which the delta advances inward as well as outward. Open water does not simply stay open unless conditions continue to favor it. Without enough current, without enough depth, without enough disturbance from flood pulses or wind, vegetation begins closing the space. Not all closure is permanent, though. That is part of the place's complexity. A flood year may push water hard through an old corridor and reopen it. A storm-driven rise in water level may float vegetation and tear weak sections apart. A change in sediment delivery may encourage one margin to build while another erodes. The delta is always receiving suggestions from water. Plants answer some of them, ignore others. And over long spans, the landscape becomes the record of that exchange. We move through a chamber of reeds so dense that sound seems to gather in the stems themselves. A warbler flicks from one stalk to another. Somewhere farther off, hidden in the green, a larger bird lifts with a slow beat of wings, then disappears again. Even the birds feel softened here, absorbed by vegetation before they can establish clear distance. That acoustic effect adds to the nearly indoor quality of the reed maze. It can feel less like traveling outdoors than passing through a series of quiet rooms. Each room has its own floor height, its own water depth, its own level of connection to the channels beyond. Some are flooded all year, some only in wetter seasons. Some are cut off for long enough that dead plant matter accumulates faster than it can fully decompose. That accumulation is how floating reed islands and quaking bog surfaces become possible. You hear the phrase quaking ground, and it sounds dramatic, but the actual experience is soft. It is simply a surface that trembles because it is not fully anchored. The trembling comes from layers, a mat of living roots above, a cushion of peat and trapped gases within, water underneath, or water saturating everything so completely that solidity becomes relative. In such places, land and water are not opposites. They are phases of one material system. That is perhaps the deepest reason the delta feels strange. Most landscapes are easy to classify at a glance. Stone is stone, a field is a field, a shore is where dry ground ends. But in the Danube Delta, categories keep dissolving. A patch of sedge may be rooted to submerged mud, or to a floating peat mat, or to a shelf of recent sediment laid down during a flood. Its appearance does not tell the whole truth. You have to ask what lies beneath. That question can be answered only with process. How did the water slow here? What was trapped? What decayed? What rooted? What rose? The boat emerges from the narrow corridor into a clearing no larger than a village pond. It feels hidden rather than open, enclosed by reeds on all sides, with only two visible passages leading out. The surface is freckled with floating leaves and fragments of stem. A dragonfly hovers, then settles. There is almost no current here, and because there is almost no current, this is exactly the sort of place where the delta quietly changes character. Fine mineral particles drifting in from upstream settle first. Organic debris settles too. The shallow bottom warms quickly in sunlight. Submerged plants can take hold if the water remains clear enough. Their leaves slow water still more. Their stems provide surfaces for algae and invertebrates. Decaying vegetation enriches the mud below. As the bottom rises, emergent plants colonize the margins. A little more trapping follows, a little more peat, a little less open water. The whole sequence can unfold gradually enough that no single moment looks decisive. Yet after enough seasons, the basin is no longer a basin in the same way. A clear pond becomes a marshy pool. A marshy pool becomes a reed-filled depression. Eventually, perhaps, only a wetter patch in a reed bed hints that open water once occupied the space. This is not a loss in the dramatic sense. It is succession, the slow replacement of one habitat by another as conditions change. But in the delta, succession never proceeds in a straight line for very long. Hydrology interrupts it. A wet spring floods the basin more deeply than usual. A strong wind resuspends bottom sediment and reduces water clarity. Fish enter and disturb the shallows. A nearby channel avulses, shifting its course and redirecting flow. The sea influences water level at the outer edge. Each factor can alter the pace or direction of vegetation growth. So the reed world is not merely advancing, it is negotiating. What you see in front of you is not the final stage of anything. It is the current expression of many competing tendencies. The boatman kills the engine once more, and for a while we drift. The drifting allows smaller evidence to come forward. There are bubbles rising through the dark water near one margin. They are not from fish. They come from gases produced in waterlogged sediment, where microbes break down organic matter without much oxygen. Methane can form in such conditions, so can carbon dioxide. Those gases remind you that even the quietest parts of the delta are active below. The mud is not inert. It is metabolizing, it is storing carbon in peat, releasing some of it again, and continuously altering the chemistry of the water above. That matters on a broad scale. Wetlands are among the planet's important carbon stores precisely because saturated soils slow decomposition enough to preserve organic matter. In the Danube Delta, the huge expanse of reed bed and marsh has accumulated vast amounts of plant carbon over time. So this soft landscape is not just collecting the continent's sediment, it is also banking the remains of its own productivity. The consequence is a place that is both geologically young and biochemically mature. Its surface may be recent, its internal cycles are deep and layered. A light wind arrives almost imperceptible, and the clearing changes immediately. The floating leaves bunch toward one side. The reflection of the sky breaks into small moving scales. Near the margin, a loose patch of reed debris turns slowly in place. This is a useful reminder that, in shallow wetlands, wind can matter nearly as much as current. A lake or pond only a little deeper than a person is tall can have its surface and bottom linked by the slightest disturbance. Sediment, resting quietly in the morning, may be resuspended by afternoon. Clouded water reduces the light reaching submerged plants. Nutrients bound to particles can be released into circulation again. Fish and invertebrates respond to those shifts. So even where the river's direct force is weak, motion continues by other means. The delta is calm, but not static. The boatman restarts the engine and chooses the left-hand exit from the clearing, where fresh green stems suggest slightly deeper, more recently flooded conditions. That, too, is a reading of plant pattern as hydrological evidence. You can often tell where water lingers longest by the species composition and density of growth. Common reed dominates much of the central delta because it tolerates wet feet and periodic flooding while also exploiting freshly deposited nutrient-rich sediment. But it does not stand alone. Sedges, cattails, willows, aquatic grasses, and submerged vegetation each occupy positions shaped by depth, inundation length, salinity, and soil stability. The arrangement is not random. It is a map of conditions written in stems instead of contour lines. And because those conditions shift, the map is constantly being updated. This is why any attempt to describe the Danube Delta in simple categories begins to fail after a while. The broad branch is freshwater, yes, but perhaps not always to the same degree near the coast. The lake is open water, yes, but perhaps only until reed encroachment narrows it. The island is land, yes, but perhaps floating land, or recently emerged land, or land built on peat soft enough to pulse under pressure. The delta keeps adding qualifiers. That is what makes it feel alive. A straight channel appears ahead, more open than the last, with a narrow strip of low muddy ground separating water from the main wall of reeds. Fresh tracks mark the mud where something has crossed recently, perhaps a small mammal or a water bird moving between pools. Bits of shell and broken stem lie scattered on the margin. The strip exists because the water level dropped after a recent high stand. That gentle fall exposes one more stage in the building process. When floodwater spreads into reed beds, suspended particles settle out among the stems. As the level recedes, those particles remain behind as a skin over older, organic material. The result can be a shallow shelf, barely raised, but enough to alter future flow. A shelf like this may dry briefly in warm weather. Seeds can germinate on it. Invertebrates colonize it. Birds feed along it. Then the next rise in water partly covers it again, connecting it back into the wetland. The shelf is both land and event. It exists because of a past inundation and will be revised by the next one. That time scale is one of the most unusual things about the delta. Mountain ranges ask you to think in millions of years. Floodplains often ask for decades or centuries. The Danube Delta asks for both the season and the long arc at once. A basin can shoal noticeably over a human lifetime. A distributary mouth can shift in a matter of years or decades, yet the overall building of the delta reflects thousands of years of sediment accumulation since sea level stabilized after the last glacial period. So when you look across this reed country, you are looking at a landscape that is ancient in origin, recent in texture, and immediate in behavior. The boat glides under a leaning willow whose roots have found purchase on slightly firmer sediment. That firmness is relative, but it matters. Trees in the delta usually occupy the more stable, slightly elevated surfaces, such as natural levees along channels, old ridges, or areas where repeated deposition has raised the ground enough to reduce prolonged waterlogging. A few extra centimeters can change everything. Drainage improves, oxygen reaches roots more easily, different plants establish. Bird nesting patterns shift. In a place as low and flat as this, topography is delicate, but still decisive. The willow marks one of those subtle thresholds. Beyond it, the channel widens and the reed walls fall back. The sudden openness is almost startling after so much enclosure. A broad, shallow lake lies ahead, bright under the late morning sky, with belts of emergent vegetation tapering into open water and faint ripples sliding across its surface. The transition feels important because it is. Inside the reed corridors, the delta's architecture is close and intimate. Out here, in the lakes and connected basins, the same processes become easier to see at landscape scale. The boatman points the bow toward the open water, and at once the wind becomes more noticeable. The lake has no dramatic shoreline. Its edge is diffuse. Reeds stand in shallows along one margin. Submerged plants darken the water beneath the surface near another. Farther out, open patches reflect the sky with almost mirror-like brightness. That blurred edge is part of what gives delta lakes their peculiar atmosphere. They are not isolated bowls cut cleanly from solid ground. They are rooms inside a much larger wet structure. Their walls can migrate. Their inlets can widen or clog. Their depths can change with flood pulses, sedimentation, and vegetation growth. One year's clear opening can be next year's marshy fringe. Seen from above on a map, the lakes may look still and definable. Seen from the water, they feel provisional. This broadening of space introduces a different kind of complexity. In the narrow reed channels, flow direction is easy to imagine, even when the current is weak. Here, movement spreads out. Wind pushes surface water toward one shore and draws deeper water back in compensation. Suspended silt clouds can drift in loose plumes. Warm and cool layers may form briefly, then mix again because the lake is too shallow to hold them apart for long. Fish move between open water and vegetated margins. Birds feed in one zone and rest in another. What looks simple from a distance turns intricate as soon as you ask how the water actually behaves. The boat moves slowly enough that you can see the lake's bottom in some places. A pale haze of fine sediment lies over darker patches where submerged vegetation grows. Then, without warning, the clear patch gives way to murkier water where the bottom disappears. That shift is not accidental. In shallow delta lakes, clarity is often temporary and patchy, because fine particles can remain suspended with very little encouragement. A stronger wind than this can stir the bottom. Schools of feeding fish can disturb soft sediment. Water entering from a channel after rain or flood may carry a new pulse of suspended matter. As those particles move, settle and rise again, the lake redraws its own underwater boundaries. That is one reason a lake here can seem full of hidden weather even on a calm day. Its conditions are responsive, immediate, and changeable. The boatman slows near a patch of open water bordered by water lilies and other floating-leaved plants. Their leaves lie flat and still, except where tiny ripples lift them at the edges. Floating-leaved vegetation occupies a very specific niche in the delta. It needs enough light for roots and submerged parts to function, enough shelter from strong wave action, and enough stability in water level for leaves to reach and remain near the surface. If sediment clouds the water too often, or if depth changes too fast, these plant communities struggle. So their presence tells you this corner has been relatively protected for a while. Protection in a delta does not mean permanence. It means a temporary balance of disturbance and calm. That balance supports not only plants, but entire food webs. Insects use the stems and undersides of leaves. Small fish shelter among them. Birds forage along the margins. Decaying plant material from these patches enriches the sediment below. The lake is a machine for cycling nutrients, and every zone within it contributes differently. Nearshore reed belts trap and stabilize. Open water allows mixing and movement. Submerged plants oxygenate local water by day and provide structure. Soft bottom mud stores organic matter, then gives some of it back through decomposition. If too much nutrient enters too quickly, algae can flourish and reduce clarity. If the water remains clearer, rooted plants gain the advantage. So the state of a shallow lake is never just a visual matter. It reflects an ongoing contest between light, sediment, plants, microbes, and disturbance. The Danube Delta contains many such lakes, each linked to channels and floodwaters in slightly different ways. That variation is part of what makes the whole wetland so ecologically rich. One basin may remain connected to distributary flow long enough to receive fresh sediment and fish migrants. Another may sit more isolated, dominated by plant growth and organic accumulation. One may be fresh almost all the time. Another, closer to the coast, may occasionally feel a faint maritime influence in its chemistry. The result is not one repeated habitat, but a mosaic. And a mosaic behaves differently from a single uniform marsh. It provides choices. Life can move among gradients of depth, oxygen, food, and shelter. The boat crosses a faint line on the lake where the water changes color from gray-green to brownish olive. There is no visible barrier, only a shift in suspended particles and reflection. That line might seem minor, but in the delta such transitions matter. Where a channel enters a lake, it may bring cooler water or more sediment, or a different nutrient load. Where wind has recently pushed silt from one shallow margin, the cloud lingers before slowly dispersing. Where aquatic plants are dense, they can calm water enough for particles to settle. So even within a single basin, small gradients form and dissolve all day long. If you imagine the lake as one body, you miss its internal weather. A shallow lake is really a conversation between wind, depth, plants, and whatever the river has brought most recently. That becomes easier to notice as the morning lengthens and the light rises high enough to flatten the reflections. Earlier, the surface held the sky like polished metal. Now it begins to reveal the faint grain of movement underneath. The boat passes over a zone where the water is only a little deeper and the color darkens by a shade. That small change in depth matters more here than it would in an ordinary lake. A few extra hand widths of water can mean less rooted vegetation, more open mud, and a greater chance that waves will stir the bottom. Then, when the bottom is stirred, the whole chemistry of the place shifts a little. Nutrients trapped in sediment can return to the water, light penetration falls, tiny algae respond, fish adjust where they feed. The lake may look calm from shore, yet it is constantly deciding which version of itself to become. The decision is never final. That is part of the delta's strange logic. Almost every basin here is temporary in character, even if it lasts for centuries in shape. One year favors clearer water and expanding submerged plants. Another year brings more suspended matter, and those plants retreat. A sequence of high floods may reconnect a quiet basin to active channels and refresh it with new mineral sediment. A run of drier seasons may let reeds take the edges and narrow the open center. So when you cross one of these lakes, you are not seeing a stable object. You are seeing a pause in a longer process. Near the middle of the basin, the wind reaches us more cleanly. Nothing blocks it now. The reed belts sit farther back, and the water gathers a low, repetitive texture, not rough, just insistently mobile. That mobility is enough. In very shallow lakes, even modest waves can touch the bottom and lift fine material into suspension. The particles do not need to travel far to alter the system. They only need to remain in the water long enough to dim the light. That dimming changes what can grow below. And what grows below affects how easily future sediment will settle. If rooted underwater plants establish dense meadows, they slow near-bottom flow and help clarify the water. If the water stays too cloudy for those plants, open mud remains exposed to disturbance. A feedback begins. Clearer water encourages vegetation. Vegetation encourages clearer water. Or the opposite. Turbid water prevents rooted growth. Without roots, sediment rises more easily, and the lake leans further into turbidity. The Danube Delta contains both tendencies, often side by side. The boatman cuts diagonally toward a low vegetated margin, where the ripples shorten and the water seems to gather itself. This is not only for shelter from wind, it is also a way of reading the lake's edges. Margins reveal process more honestly than open centers do. At the edge, you can see where silt has been laid down in a thin fan after recent inflow. You can see where wave action has undercut a small peat shelf. You can see which plants tolerate fluctuating water and which need a little more stability. Here, along this margin, the stems are mixed. Reeds stand in deeper patches. Lower sedges and grasses occupy a muddy shelf just above them. Farther in, where the ground rises by only a small amount, a different green begins. That sequence is a quiet topographic map. It tells you how often each strip floods. It tells you where water lingers longest. It tells you how the lake and marsh exchange territory. A low wave runs ahead of the bow and laps against the shelf. The mud does not hold its shape sharply. It rounds off. It softens. A few flecks drift away and cloud the water for a moment. That tiny erosion matters because, multiplied across a huge wetland, it helps redraw boundaries. The delta is not only built by deposition, it is also edited by removal. Waves nibble one edge while silt builds another. A channel scours slightly during high water and deepens enough to remain open another season. Elsewhere, reduced flow allows a margin to advance into the lake. Nothing here needs to happen dramatically to be important. The scale is broad, but the actions are usually small. Ahead, a narrow opening in the vegetation leads into a side basin almost hidden from the larger lake. The boatman chooses it without hesitation. That choice reveals another truth of the delta. Large spaces are always connected to smaller ones. A broad basin opens into a channel. The channel feeds a pond. The pond overflows into reed marsh. The marsh, in a wet season, may reconnect to another lake entirely. This nesting of spaces is one reason the wetlands support such layered ecological life. They use different levels of connection. A fish may need open branch channels to move long distances, flooded shallows to spawn, and vegetated margins for shelter while young. A water bird may feed in one depth zone at dawn, rest in another by midday, and nest in reed cover farther away. Insects emerge from still corners rich in decaying vegetation, then feed creatures using open water. The delta works because it contains transitions, not because it simplifies them. We enter the side basin, and at once the wind relaxes. The surface becomes smoother, though never entirely still. A film of pollen has gathered along the lee shore in long yellow streaks. Fragments of dead reed rest in the corners like driftwood in miniature. This kind of sheltered basin often behaves differently from the open lake beyond. Water stays in it longer, suspended matter has more time to settle. Organic debris accumulates. Summer warmth can become more pronounced. Oxygen near the bottom may drop if decomposition outruns mixing. That does not make the basin poor. It makes it distinct. Shallow wetlands need variety in water residence time, in clarity, in vegetation cover, and in chemical conditions. A place where water pauses for a week is not the same habitat as a place where it pauses for a month. A place repeatedly stirred by wind is not the same as a pocket protected by reeds on all sides. The delta's abundance grows from that layered arrangement. At the mouth of this side basin, the boat passes over a faint ridge beneath the water. The hull gives the slightest change in sound. That ridge is likely a small deposit where inflowing water slowed as it entered wider space. Sediment often gathers at such points, not enough to notice from a map, enough to redirect local flow. Over time, deposits like this can separate one basin into two shallower parts. Then plants seize the new shallows. A bar becomes a fringe. A fringe becomes a belt. A belt divides what once looked like a single open water body. This is how wetlands multiply complexity. They do not need cliffs or canyons. They create architecture from subtle differences in depth. The side basin opens wider than expected. Its water is greener, and the bottom can no longer be seen. That color suggests suspended microscopic life as much as suspended sediment. When nutrients are available and light remains sufficient, planktonic algae can flourish in shallow delta waters. They form the base of food webs for many small organisms. Yet too much algal growth can also reduce clarity and shift a basin away from rooted plant dominance. Again, there is no single ideal state. Different basins perform different roles. Some are clearer and plant-rich. Some are more turbid and plankton-driven. Some alternate between the two depending on season, flood timing, or the force of recent winds. If the lake system were uniform, it would be simpler to describe. It would also be less alive. A flock of small birds rises from the reeds ahead, circles once, and settles elsewhere with barely a sound. The motion leaves the basin undisturbed almost immediately. That quick return to quiet can be misleading. Under the surface, tiny grazers are feeding on algae. Larvae live among stems and soft-bottom debris. Fish are moving at levels you cannot see. In shallow waters, the distance between sunlight and sediment is so short that everything interacts quickly. Light reaches leaves and mud. Plants affect oxygen. Microbes process dead matter. Nutrients cycle up again. Because of that short distance, shallow lakes often behave more dynamically than deep ones. There is less separation between bottom and surface. The whole water column is intimate with the ground. That intimacy explains why these basins are sensitive to even mild disturbance. But it also explains their productivity. The boatman lets the boat drift, while he points toward a darker line of water crossing the basin from one side. At first it seems like shadow. Then the shape clarifies. A slight current enters from a reed-hidden channel, not enough to wrinkle the surface much, enough to carry a slow-moving tongue of differently colored water into the basin. This is the sort of subtle inflow that keeps many delta lakes from becoming isolated altogether. Even where open water seems self-contained, there are often gentle exchanges underway. Fresh inflow may bring oxygen, suspended sediment, cooler temperature, fish, seeds, or dissolved nutrients. Outflow may be equally quiet, slipping away through another low passage when water level rises. The important thing is not speed, it is connectivity. The delta functions as a network because these exchanges persist across seasons and scales. Some are obvious enough to navigate by, others are visible only in color, temperature, or plant pattern. The consequence is that no lake here is entirely solitary. Even the most enclosed basin belongs to a larger circulation. The boat turns to follow the darker line toward its source. That movement takes us into a narrower throat, where the water is visibly shallower and the bottom shows tracks and plant debris laid in parallel by previous flow. A place like this can alternate roles through the year. During flood season, it may carry water energetically enough to link lake and marsh. In late summer, it may become a sluggish connection where fish pass only if the level stays high. In dry periods, dense vegetation may nearly close it. Then a wetter year reopens it again. This reversibility gives the delta its unfinished feeling. Almost nothing here stays in one category forever. A corridor can become a filter. A lake can become a marsh. A marsh can partly reopen to shallow water. The broader pattern persists, but local forms keep changing. As we pass through the throat, the smell of the water alters slightly. There is more vegetation here, more decomposition. more of the sweet, earthy note of warm organic mud. That smell is part of the delta's internal chemistry. Where plant material is abundant and water exchange slows, decomposition shapes conditions strongly, oxygen near the sediment can drop, certain nutrients become more available, dissolved organic compounds darken the water. Microbial life flourishes in forms suited to low oxygen environments. These chemical conditions are not incidental background. They influence where fish can linger, where eggs develop well, where insect larvae thrive, and where particular plants can take root. A wetland is often described by what stands above the surface, but much of its identity lies in what happens invisibly between mud and water. The channel widens again into a shallower, brighter basin where floating leaves gather in clusters. Some are broad and round, others are narrow, almost arrow-shaped. Their arrangement is irregular, following depth and shelter rather than any neat line. Floating leaves are useful markers because they show where the water is calm enough for them to persist and shallow enough for rooted plants to maintain contact with the bottom. They also demonstrate how surfaces in the delta can look full while still remaining open. A floating leaved basin is neither bare water nor solid marsh. It occupies a middle condition. The leaves shade the water beneath. They reduce local wave energy. They provide cover for small animals. And when they die back, they add another seasonal layer of organic matter to the soft bottom. That seasonal addition matters. The delta is built not only by particles arriving from far away, it is built by annual cycles of growth collapsing into place. Last year's stems become this year's sedimentary influence. This year's leaves will feed next year's mud. A large fish rolls just under the leaves, disturbing them in a widening ring. Then the surface closes again. That brief motion points toward one of the delta's most important ecological roles. Shallow, vegetated waters are nurseries. Many fish species use these quiet margins and flood-connected basins during key life stages because they offer warmth, food, and shelter from stronger currents. Floods are especially important in this regard. When river levels rise and spill into wetlands, fish gain access to broad feeding and spawning grounds that are unavailable at lower water. Eggs and larvae benefit from the productivity of flooded vegetation and warm shallows. Young fish can shelter among stems and roots. When the water later falls, some return to channels and larger lakes, carrying the wetland's productivity outward. So the seasonal instability of the delta is not a problem for life here. It is the condition that supports it. The boatman rests one hand on the tiller and keeps the speed almost absurdly low. That slowness lets another process become visible. Tiny particles are falling through the water in the sunlit shallows. Some are mineral, some are plant fragments. Some may be tiny living organisms drifting with almost no power of their own. In deeper lakes, such settling is mostly hidden. Here it is part of the visible day. The water is always making the next layer. That is why these basins can age quickly in geomorphic terms. A shallow lake does not need massive amounts of sediment to begin changing form. It needs only a persistent excess of deposition over removal. Add plant growth to that, and the transformation accelerates. Still, the process never becomes simple. If a strong flood opens a new connection, a basin may deepen locally by scour. If waves erode a peat margin, open water may expand again. If brackish influence near the coast changes plant communities, succession may follow a different path. Every tendency in the delta meets another tendency somewhere nearby. The boat exits the floating leaves and enters a more open lane between low marsh shelves. The light has shifted toward afternoon now, and the sun lies at an angle that reveals suspended material in long slanting bands beneath the surface. That light makes the lake look layered, though the layers are not stable for long. Shallow water resists neat stratification, wind mixes it, temperature changes quickly. Inflows undercut one patch and spread over another. The result is a body of water always adjusting itself. That adjustment is what gives the lakes of the Danube Delta their strange calm. They appear placid because the forces acting on them are gentle. But gentle does not mean simple. The day advances, and with it comes a little more breeze from the direction of the sea. This matters. By now, the wetland is no longer shaped only by river processes. The further east you move through the delta, the more another influence begins to appear, not as open salt water at first, but as a pressure at the edge of things. The Black Sea does not enter the interior as a dramatic wave. It arrives through level changes, coastal winds, brackish backwaters, and the way shoreline forms redirect water. The transition is subtle. A basin remains mostly fresh. A channel still carries river water. Yet the outer geometry of bars, lagoons, and shore ridges begins to matter more. What looked like the end of a river system starts to feel like the interior of a coastal machine. The boatman angles toward a wider channel that leads seaward. This is a narrative decision as much as a route choice. The inner lakes explain how the delta works from within. The outer margins reveal why its edges never stay simple. As we leave the basin, the water grows slightly more open, the sky broader, and the wind steadier. Reeds still dominate much of the horizon, but the horizon itself has changed. It feels less enclosed by wetland, more exposed. That exposure is the first sign that the delta is nearing the coast. The channel broadens and straightens, though not perfectly. On one side runs a low natural levee, only faintly raised above the waterline, enough for shrubs and occasional trees to gather where prolonged flooding is less severe. On the other side, the reed marsh spreads almost without interruption. Natural levees in deltas are easy to overlook because they are rarely dramatic. They form when floodwater spills out of a channel and loses velocity quickly along the banks, dropping coarser suspended material first. Repeated floods build these low ridges gradually. A few extra centimeters of height create better drainage. Better drainage allows different vegetation, and different vegetation makes the ridge more legible as a line through the marsh. Such ridges can become preferred routes for roots, burrows, birds, and sometimes entire strips of woodland in an otherwise saturated world. They are another example of how tiny differences in elevation produce major ecological consequences here. The boat follows the levee edge for a while. Mud along its base shows old water lines and the remains of recently stranded plant debris. This is evidence that levels here fluctuate not only with river discharge, but with wind setup and backwater effects. When strong winds press water against the coast, levels in connected channels and lagoons can rise inland. When they relax, water drains seaward again. The delta is so low that the distinction between river-driven and sea-influenced level change is not always obvious at a glance. That ambiguity adds to the sense that the landscape is breathing rather than holding still. Ahead, the channel splits around a low island of reeds and silt. The right branch looks clearer but shallower. The left seems slightly darker and more direct. The boatman takes the left branch. That choice reveals a pattern often repeated near the coast. Water does not merely seek the shortest path to the sea. It seeks the path allowed by depth, bars, vegetation, and the legacy of previous floods and storms. A mouth branch that advanced sediment outward for years may later shoal and force more flow elsewhere. A side channel, once minor, may become more important after another clogs. This shifting division of discharge is how deltas migrate internally. Their distributaries compete gently with one another through time. Some build outward, some stagnate, some are abandoned and preserved as curved lakes or marsh channels after the main flow shifts away. The branch we enter carries faintly browner water, a sign that recent inflow still delivers suspended sediment here. That sediment is part of the continuing negotiation between river and sea. If river discharge dominates, mouths can prograde outward, building new bars and extending the delta front. If marine currents and waves dominate, sediment can be spread along the coast, reworked into beaches and ridges, or removed from the mouth entirely. The shape of the shoreline depends on the balance between those patient forces. The Danube Delta is strange not because either force is unusual alone, but because both are active and neither fully wins. As the afternoon light softens, the channel banks lower further. The wetland begins to look flatter, younger, less rooted in any permanent arrangement. Sand appears mixed with mud in places. That is another signal of the coastal margin, where waves and longshore currents work sediment along the outer edge. Sandy forms become more common, spits, bars, beach ridges, and barrier-like strips that can partly isolate lagoons behind them. A delta shoreline is not just a muddy fan. It is often a composite of river deposits and marine reworking. The sea edits what the river delivers. Sometimes it smooths the edge, sometimes it interrupts it. Sometimes it seals one opening and encourages another to become dominant. The channel widens into a brackish-smelling openness where the water's texture changes. Not full sea yet, something between. A long, low ridge lies ahead, barely above the water in places, with sparse vegetation catching the light. Behind it, glimpses of quieter water appear. This is one of the outer borderlands of the delta, the zone of lagoons, coastal barriers, and intermittently connected basins where freshwater and sea influence overlap. What makes these places feel unusual is that they are neither river mouth nor ordinary coast. A lagoon may be cut off from direct sea exchange for long periods, growing fresher under river influence. Then a storm or coastal reshaping may reopen a connection. Salinity rises, species composition shifts, sediment settles differently. Water chemistry changes. That is why the outer delta can never be described by a single line on a map for very long. A line suggests certainty, but this coast is built from thresholds. A sandy ridge may stand a little higher after one season of wave-built accumulation. Then a later period of erosion may lower it again and let more exchange pass across or through it. Behind such ridges, lagoons can become quiet, settling basins. In front of them, the sea continues sorting sediment by grain size, wave energy, and current direction. The boat moves parallel to the low barrier for a while, and the difference between the two sides becomes easier to feel than to see. On the lagoon side, the water is flatter, a little darker, and interrupted by reeds and muddy shallows. On the seaward side, even from a distance, the surface carries a more regular pulse. That pulse is important. Rivers deliver material forward. Waves move it sideways. Where those motions meet, the coast develops its own patient logic. Mud brought by the Danube does not simply pile up wherever it arrives. Fine particles may remain in suspension and spread into coastal plumes. Sands may be pushed into bars and beach ridges. Storms may cut new openings or close old ones with astonishing quiet, not in a single theatrical moment, but through repeated hours of water rearranging grains. The strangeness of the Danube Delta deepens here because the landscape is being edited from two directions at once. The river is always trying to build outward. The sea is always trying to sort, smooth, and redistribute what arrives. Neither force erases the other. Instead, they leave a coastline full of partial memories. A former mouth becomes a wet depression behind a sand ridge. An old shore survives as a line of slightly higher ground inland. A lagoon records an older separation from the sea, then slowly changes as freshwater influence grows stronger. The boatman points toward a pale strip of sand where sparse plants cling to the upper slope. It looks simple, almost modest after so much marsh. But that simplicity is deceptive. A barrier ridge like this is a record of marine work. Waves approach the shore, spend their energy, and leave sediment in elongated forms along the coast. If enough sand accumulates, it can isolate shallow water behind it. Once isolation begins, the water body behind the ridge changes character. Wave energy drops. Fine particles settle more easily. Reeds and other marsh plants advance from the margins. Freshwater inflow from the delta may gradually reduce salinity. So a coastal lagoon is not just water left behind. It is a new environment produced by separation. The consequence can be profound. Fish communities shift. Aquatic vegetation changes. Bird use changes. Even the color and smell of the water can alter over time. That layered, transitional quality is everywhere along the outer edge. Nothing is simply coast. Nothing is simply river. Even the sandbars feel provisional. The boat noses into a broad, mouth-like opening between low deposits, and the water spreads into a zone where suspended sediment hangs in soft brown veils. This is where one of the distributary branches releases itself into coastal space. The current is not fast. Still, you can see that it has more direction here than in the lakes behind us. The branch carries the continent forward one more time. Then, just beyond the mouth, that momentum loosens into the wider sea. When fresh river water enters saltier marine water, it behaves differently according to density, wind, discharge, and local mixing. Sometimes it spreads as a buoyant surface plume. Sometimes waves and turbulence mix it downward more quickly. Fine sediment carried in that plume may settle when the water loses energy. It may also flocculate, which means tiny particles clump together under changing chemical conditions and sink more readily. That small-scale chemistry helps determine where new deposits gather near the delta front. So even at the mouth, the making of land is not only mechanical, it is chemical, hydrological, and coastal all at once. A thin line of foam bends along one side of the outflow. Beyond it, the sea takes on a greener color. The boundary is blurred, but not invisible. This is one of the few places where the Danube briefly seems like a river again, because for a moment it has a direction strong enough to announce itself against the receiving water. Yet even here, certainty does not last. Coastal currents begin pulling at the plume. Wind pushes the surface sideways. Sediment spreads beyond the neat idea of a mouth. The plume becomes a stain, then a haze, then a memory in the sea. If enough material accumulates near the shore, a mouth bar can form. That bar may partly block the channel, encouraging sediment to gather still more. Flow then seeks deeper flanking paths. In time, the branch can split, shift, or lose prominence. This is how distributary systems reinvent themselves at the coast. Their seaward edge is never finished. The boatman does not press into open sea. Instead, he follows the mouth's margin where river water glides past shallow banks and newly formed deposits just below the surface. That choice keeps the process visible. Near the bank, you can see broken shell fragments mixed with sand and dark mud. You can see how young the ground looks, how little it resembles settled inland earth. This is recent material, still being arranged. The plants are sparse, low, and opportunistic. Only species tolerant of burial, salinity shifts, and unstable substrates can gain a foothold here. That ecological selectiveness is another clue to the coast's youthfulness. A mature, stable surface supports long occupation. A forming shoreline supports pioneers. Some parts of the Danube Delta advance in this way, building outward where sediment supply and flow remain strong enough. Other parts do not. Farther along the coast, where river input is weaker or marine energy stronger, erosion may dominate. Shorelines retreat. Older deposits are cut back. Formerly emergent ground becomes beach or shallow water again. So the delta does not grow evenly. It sends forward some lobes while losing ground on others. That unevenness contributes to the sense that the whole region is strangely alive. It is not marching seaward in one clean movement. It is experimenting with shape. The boat rounds a bend in the mouth margin and enters a quieter lee where a thin beach has formed against the back of a low ridge. Drifted reed stems lie scattered above the last high water mark. Each stranded bundle is evidence of recent level change and wave action. Even when the weather now is mild, the coast remembers rougher days. Storms matter here not because they are dramatic events to narrate, but because they perform major work in short spans. They can overtop barriers, carry sand inland, reopen channels across beach ridges, or seal shallow inlets with freshly moved sediment. Then, after the storm water has withdrawn, the reshaped coast remains. A lagoon finds itself more connected or less connected than before. A distributary mouth feels new resistance from a bar. A marsh margin receives sand where before it received only mud. Those revisions accumulate. Over decades and centuries, They create a coastline full of inherited irregularities. The Danube Delta keeps old shorelines tucked inside newer ones. It keeps abandoned mouths beside active mouths. It keeps brackish basins near freshwater marshes and young sand along ancient peat. That is why the outer delta can feel like several ages of landscape compressed together at ground level. The boatman beaches the bow gently on the sandy edge for a moment, just enough to let the hull rest without force. When you step out, the sand gives slightly, then firms. After so much mud and peat, the sensation is almost surprising. This is still soft land, but soft in a different way. Sand drains quickly compared with marsh soils. It warms differently. It shifts under wind as well as water. Its plant communities are lower, patchier, more exposed. You can feel, by the ground alone, that the sea is close. Behind you lies the wet, organic interior of the delta. Ahead lies a coast built from sorting. The difference is fundamental. In the interior, vegetation slows water and traps fine material. At the edge, waves and currents winnow, rearrange, and grade sediment according to size and energy. Both processes make land. They just make different kinds of land. The boatman lifts a handful of damp sand and lets it fall. On a beach ridge, the grains are coarser than the suspended silts that built so much of the marsh behind us. Coarser grains require more energetic movement to be transported. That means the ridge records wave work directly. Mud settles from suspension in quiet water. Sand usually needs agitation to move, so whenever you encounter a distinct sandy form within the delta's outer zones, you are looking at the sea's handwriting. That handwriting can overwrite older river-made surfaces, but not completely. Often the two coexist. A sand ridge may cap or border muddy deposits. A lagoon behind it may continue receiving fine sediment from the delta interior. The result is a stitched landscape, marine seam against river cloth. We stand only briefly. Then the boat pushes off again, slipping back into a channel that runs behind the barrier. This back barrier water is calmer, shallower, and rich with signs of partial isolation. Fine organic scum collects in corners. Reed patches advance from the margins. A few open reaches remain, but they feel enclosed, as if waiting to become something else. Back barrier lagoons and shallow coastal lakes are especially good at holding transitional histories. If the sea connection narrows, freshwater influence grows, sediment settles, vegetation thickens. If a new breach opens, marine water enters more freely, salinity rises. The bottom fauna changes. The plant communities adjust or retreat. Over long spans, repeated opening and closure can produce a remarkably complicated patchwork of habitats within a very low landscape. The boatman traces one such narrow connection to its source, where the channel bends through low, muddy banks toward a broader basin farther inland. As we enter, the salinity influence becomes less obvious, though not absent. This is one of the outer rooms of the delta, where maritime and fluvial forces overlap without fully merging. The science of such overlap can seem abstract until you watch what it does to living communities. Plants that tolerate brackish conditions occupy one strip. Freshwater reeds reclaim another. Fish that can move between salinity ranges use passages when they are open. Invertebrates change with the chemistry. The edge is not visible as a line on the water, but the organisms know where it lies. That hidden ecological boundary is one reason the outer delta feels uncanny. The place is full of zones that look similar from the boat yet function differently beneath the surface. A marsh is not just a marsh. Its salinity, flood timing, depth, and sediment source may all differ from the basin beside it. The boat glides into the basin and the water becomes mirror-like again. Yet the coast remains present in subtler ways. The air is different. The wind arrives less filtered. And the geometry of the land, low ridges alternating with shallow waters, reflects marine reworking even where reeds now dominate. What appears, at first, to be ordinary marsh may sit behind an old beach ridge, itself marking a former shoreline. In deltas, the present surface often conceals earlier edges. Each old edge influences drainage and vegetation long after it stops being a coast. That is one reason former shorelines matter so much. They create slightly raised lines in a flat country. Those lines redirect floodwater. They provide firmer ground for shrubs or trees. They partition lakes from marshes. They preserve the memory of where sea once stood relative to land. The Danube Delta carries many such traces. It is a young surface with a layered past. The boatman points toward a low arc of drier ground carrying different plants than the marsh around it. That arc is likely one of those inherited coastal forms. Its existence helps answer a question that has been growing beneath the journey all day. Why does the Danube Delta seem less like one place than a moving collection of partial places? The answer, increasingly, is that it has been built by overlapping systems with different tempos. The Danube delivers sediment season by season, flood by flood. Reeds and marsh plants trap and transform it year by year. Peat accumulates slowly but steadily. Waves reshape barriers over storms and decades. Coastal currents sort sand along shore. Sea level history sets the broader stage over thousands of years. No single clock governs the wetland, so no single shape can summarize it. That temporal mismatch is a quiet source of the delta's strangeness. A storm can redraw an inlet overnight. A reed mat may take years to thicken enough to matter. A lake may spend decades becoming shallower, then reconnect in one flood season. A former shoreline may linger for centuries as a subtle ridge. When all those tempos overlap in one low landscape, the result feels less like scenery and more like ongoing thought. The afternoon has begun to lean toward evening. The light lowers, and the outer basins become less reflective and more dimensional. Reed shadows stretch across the water. Bird movement grows easier to notice. Until now, the delta has been explained mostly by its materials and forces. But at some point, the living inhabitants must come forward, because they reveal what the unfinished landscape is for. A place this unstable could seem, from a distance, unsuited to permanence. Yet it supports extraordinary abundance precisely because so many conditions exist close together. The boat turns away from the most exposed coast and begins drifting back into a broad wetland interior where open water, reed beds, and low mud margins overlap in the long light. That inward turn is more than a route change. It is a shift in perspective. The earlier question was how the delta is built. Now the question becomes how life uses a landform that never quite settles. The answer begins with birds, because birds make the wetland legible at a glance. Over the far reed line, long white shapes move in slow procession. Closer in, smaller dark birds flick low over the water. On a muddy shelf, waders pick through the shallows with quick, precise steps. The differences are not random. Each posture reflects a habitat choice tied to depth, food, and cover. A shallow shelf rich in invertebrates attracts probing feeders. Open water favors divers and surface feeders. Dense reeds provide nesting, concealment, and roosting. Trees on slightly higher levees support other species altogether. Because the delta contains all these zones in shifting combinations, it can support immense bird diversity and, at certain times of year, astonishing concentrations. The strangeness of the place is not only that land and water blur, it is that the blur creates options. The boatman eases toward a reed-fringed margin, where the water is only knee-deep near shore, and tiny fish flash just beneath the surface. This narrow belt of warmth and shelter is as important as the broad channel or open lagoon. Many young fish depend on exactly this kind of environment. In spring, when floodwaters spread into marshes and side basins, they create access to productive shallows rich in plankton, insect larvae, and decaying plant matter. Eggs can be laid among flooded vegetation. Larvae develop in comparatively warm, food-rich water. Juveniles shelter from strong current and many larger predators in dense cover. Later, as levels change, some of these young fish move outward into channels and lakes. That means the wetland is not merely a place where fish live, it is a place where many fish become possible. Seasonal flooding is the key. Without periodic access to these temporary habitats, the nursery function would shrink. The very instability that makes the delta hard to map is what allows so much life to recruit and renew itself. A line of frogs slips off the mud shelf as the boat approaches. They vanish into water so shallow it barely seems enough to hide in. Amphibians thrive in parts of the delta for similar reasons. Temporary pools, flooded edges, still backwaters, and vegetated shallows provide breeding conditions that drier, more uniform landscapes cannot offer. Insects, too, are part of this abundance, though they often remain beneath notice until evening light catches them. Some develop in submerged stems, some in decaying organic mats. Some emerge from nutrient-rich shallows and become food for birds, bats, fish, and amphibians in their brief adult lives. A wetland of this scale functions through swarms and subtle exchanges, not only through large visible animals. The quiet richness lies in the small lives cycling quickly through habitats that themselves are temporary. The boat crosses into a wider interior lake, where the surface is bronze under the late sun. At first it seems empty. Then the details separate. A long-necked bird stands motionless in the shallows. Farther out, a cluster of diving birds disappears almost in unison. Near the reeds, small ripples betray fish feeding at the surface. Everywhere, the distribution of life follows structure. Open water, vegetated margin, soft mud, deeper pocket, floating leaves, reed wall. Each zone hosts different activity. The delta supports hidden lives because it is not one habitat repeated endlessly. It is a fine-grained mosaic, and the boundaries between pieces are porous. That porosity matters. A fish can move from channel to flooded grassland when water rises. An invertebrate-rich mudflat may exist for only a few weeks, yet be heavily used while it does. A colony of nesting birds may depend on a reed island that is safe only while surrounding water remains high enough to deter ground predators. The ecology is organized around timing as much as location. The boatman stops speaking altogether now, and the silence makes the biological complexity easier to feel. A colony does not need to be seen directly to be present. The air above certain reed stretches carries the faint movement of many wings. Distant calls travel across the water in layers. One species settles as another lifts. The delta is full of hidden density. This is especially true during migration. Because the Danube Delta lies along major flyways and contains such extensive wetlands, it serves as a resting, feeding and breeding landscape for vast numbers of birds moving between continents and climates. For a migrating bird, this place is not a scenic stop. It is an enormous reservoir of food, water, and shelter distributed across many habitat types. Shallow lakes offer feeding grounds. Reed beds offer concealment and nesting sites. Mud margins expose invertebrates. Open channels provide fish. Seasonal change continually renews some of these opportunities. A stable, fully fixed landscape would be simpler. It would also support fewer transitions, and transitions are where much of the delta's ecological richness lives. We drift toward a patch of floating vegetation, where dragonflies skim low and fast over the water. Beneath them, small fish dart among stems. This is a simple scene, but it expresses the whole wetland logic. Plants structure space, invertebrates use the structure, fish use both plants and invertebrates. Birds use the fish and the sheltered water. When the plants die back, their remains feed microbes and detritivores, enriching sediment and water for the next cycle. Nothing is wasted in a marsh, at least not in ecological terms. Dead growth becomes future fertility. Flooded decay becomes food web. Mud becomes nursery. What looks soft and formless from a distance is actually highly organized by energy, depth, oxygen, and season. The boatman uses the pole again to push through a thin mat of loose stems, and in doing so he reveals the dark water beneath. There are bubbles there, and the smell of rich mud rises softly. Such places are full of decomposers. Bacteria and fungi break down the annual fall of leaves and stalks. Invertebrates chew and shred the material into smaller fragments. Nutrients re-enter circulation. Some carbon remains stored in the sediment, especially where waterlogging limits oxygen. Some escapes back into the atmosphere. The balance depends on hydrology, temperature, and the chemistry of the soil. So even the seemingly inactive layers of rotting vegetation are part of the living engine. Wetlands like this are productive not despite decomposition, but because of it. Life in the delta depends on the constant conversion of dead plant matter into usable forms. That becomes especially clear as evening lowers over the water because the feeding patterns begin to rearrange in front of you. Along the reed edge, insects gather in denser clouds, and suddenly the air itself becomes part of the wetland's food chain. Small birds skim low to catch them. Fish rise from below in quick, circular breaks of the surface. Bats, if you stay long enough into dusk, will take the same invisible harvest from a different angle. The productivity of the delta is never stored in one place. It moves. It passes from flooded plants to microbes, from microbes to invertebrates, from invertebrates to fish and birds, then back again into sediment and decay. That circulation helps explain why so many species can use ground that seems at first glance so uncertain. In most landscapes, stability is the basis of abundance. Here, renewal is. A shallow bay that floods in spring may be among the richest nurseries for fish in the whole system. A mudflat exposed only briefly may feed thousands of birds before water returns. A channel choked by reeds may seem to be disappearing, yet the trapped organic matter inside it is preparing the conditions for another suite of plants and animals. The delta keeps creating temporary wealth, and life here has learnt to arrive when that wealth appears. Seasonality is the quiet master of this place. Not in the dramatic sense of hardship and rescue, but in the gentler sense of recurring access. In spring, snowmelt and rain from far inland enlarge the Danube and increase the spread of water into the wetland. That inundation carries suspended sediment, dissolved nutrients, fish, and cool energy from upstream. It also carries possibility. Low meadows flood, reed beds deepen, side basins reconnect, spawning grounds open. Eggs can be laid among stems that were dry enough a few weeks earlier to rustle in the wind. Then summer changes the terms. Warmth increases biological activity. Plants race upward. In shallow, sheltered waters, decomposition becomes more chemically powerful. Oxygen can vary sharply between day and night in dense vegetation. Some pools grow greener with algae, others clear as rooted plants take hold. The landscape does not merely look fuller, it becomes metabolically faster. Autumn shifts things again. Migrating birds gather. Some fish move differently as temperatures fall. Vegetation begins to collapse back into the water and onto the mud. The annual architecture of stems and leaves starts becoming next year's peat and detritus. Then winter, in colder years, quiets the margins. Ice may form in sheltered areas. Surface motion slows. What was a nursery becomes a resting plain of reeds and pale water under low light. Yet even then, the delta is not inactive. Sediment still settles. Organic matter still changes slowly in saturated soils. Channels still retain their subtle exchanges. The boat glides into a broad backwater where the evening sky reflects in long strips between dark reed shadows. From somewhere hidden in the marsh comes the low, resonant call of a larger bird, then another farther off. Distance in the delta is often heard before it is seen. That matters because so much of the life here occupies cover. A vast bird colony can exist behind a wall of reeds and remain almost entirely invisible from the wrong angle. A fish-rich side channel can look empty until the light catches movement. An amphibian-filled ditch may reveal itself only through sound after sunset. The wetland is full of concealed abundance, and concealment itself is one of the gifts the shifting landscape provides. Dense reeds are not just plants. They are vertical shelter. They protect nests from view. They break wind. They muffle sound. They divide open water into smaller compartments, making exposure less continuous. Floating reed islands extend that function further. Because they can drift, rise, and sag with water levels, they create breeding and resting surfaces that are difficult to predict and hard to classify. For certain birds, that uncertainty is an advantage. A colony established on a partly floating mass may be less accessible from below than one on fixed ground. For fish, the submerged roots beneath such islands make tangled refuge. For invertebrates, they are whole layered habitats hanging above dark water. So when you look at a floating island in the Danube Delta, you are not looking at an odd curiosity. You are looking at a platform of opportunity built by instability itself. The boatman steers along the margin of one such island now. Its upper surface appears firm enough for shrubs and coarse grasses. Its lower edge dissolves into roots, peat, and trailing stems, where the water darkens beneath it. That underside is easy to overlook, but ecologically, it may matter as much as the top. Shaded water tends to remain cooler in heat. Roots create surfaces for algae, snails, insect larvae, and microbial films. Small fish use the cover. Predators patrol the edge. Even decomposition differs there, because oxygen, light, and temperature are altered by the hanging mass. A floating island turns water into interior space, and in a flat wetland, interior space is precious. We drift past a muddy shelf where hoof-like prints crisscross the soft margin beside bird tracks and the delicate drag marks of tails. You do not need to identify every animal to understand the message. Many creatures use these edges because edges are where resources overlap. Water meets mud, mud meets vegetation. Open sightlines meet concealment. Soft margins also record presence better than dry ground. A passage leaves evidence for hours or days until the next rise in water or the next wash of wind-softened ripples erases it. That is another reason the delta feels unfinished. It remembers briefly, then lets go. The same is true at larger scale. A flood season may leave broad, shallow lakes where none were obvious before. A dry period may isolate pools and expose connecting shelves. A winter freeze may simplify the surface. Then spring reopens complexity. Life in the Danube Delta does not depend on permanence. It depends on recurring patterns of partial connection. This becomes easier to appreciate when you consider fish, because fish tie the whole wetland together in ways that are mostly hidden. A large river branch may seem separate from a reed basin, yet when floodwater rises, the barrier between them loosens. A species that spends most of the year in deeper channels can enter warmed floodplain shallows at exactly the time when food is abundant and shelter extensive. Young fish may then spend weeks in habitats that will not exist in the same form later in the year. As water drops, some are forced back. Some remain in shrinking basins. Some move into lakes and side channels. The entire wetland becomes a moving nursery map. And because the map changes with hydrology, fish populations are linked to the shape-shifting geography itself. That is one of the gentlest but most important ecological truths here. Change is not an interruption of function. It is the function. The boatman turns into a side passage where the water is smooth and black beneath overhanging reed stems. Here, the smell of warm vegetation deepens. On the surface, tiny patches of duckweed gather in corners where almost no current remains. These still pockets matter disproportionately. They may be low in oxygen near the bottom. They may hold water longer than nearby channels. They may accumulate fine organic particles too soft for larger wave-exposed basins to keep. Such conditions support different communities from the ones in open lake water only a short distance away. Certain invertebrates prefer the stillness. Amphibians may breed in these quieter waters. Microbial processes differ. Submerged plants may either flourish or fail depending on turbidity and shading. Because the delta offers so many combinations of depth, flow, temperature, and chemistry, species can sort themselves into fine ecological positions. That sorting is one reason biodiversity in wetlands often depends on variation more than average conditions. A single stable lake would be easier to describe. A network of shifting basins, flooded margins, reed chambers, and brackish outer waters is much harder to summarize, but it supports far more overlap. The side passage opens into a round, pond-like basin no wider than a few boat lengths. The place feels closed, almost secret. Its surface is scattered with fragments of last season's stems. A few emergent plants still stand in the middle, surrounded by reflected sky. This kind of hidden basin may only connect strongly during certain water levels. At other times, it is nearly isolated. That near isolation changes everything. Water residence time increases. Sediment settles more completely. Organic matter accumulates. Temperature swings can become sharper. Predators that move through larger channels may visit less often. For larvae, fry, and small invertebrates, that can create temporary refuge. The delta is full of these semi-private rooms, and many species use them not because they are permanent, but because they are briefly favorable. A place does not need to last forever to matter. It only needs to appear at the right time. That principle scales all the way up to migration. When vast numbers of birds move along continental routes, they do not require one perfect habitat repeated endlessly. They require networks of stopping places where conditions align with their needs during passage. The Danube Delta is one of those rare places where alignment happens in many forms at once. Fish-rich shallows, mud margins heavy with invertebrates, quiet roosting waters, dense reed cover, open feeding lakes, brackish edges with their own specialized food webs. And because the system is always reworking itself, those opportunities are renewed rather than used up. The strange quality of the delta, then, is not only physical softness, it is ecological generosity built from constant revision. A heron lifts from the edge of the hidden basin and passes over the boat with slow, deliberate wing beats. Its legs trail behind like reeds in motion. Then it settles somewhere you cannot see. That disappearance into cover is typical of the wetland. Animals here are often revealed only briefly, as if the landscape allows you a glimpse and then folds them back into itself. This is especially true in the dense central reed beds, where sound often exceeds sight. Brooding birds remain hidden. Marsh-dwelling mammals leave tracks more often than visible bodies. Fish announce themselves only as rings and flickers. Even the colonies of larger, brighter birds can vanish into distance because the terrain is so low and partitioned. The result is a landscape that feels inhabited everywhere and exposed nowhere. As the boat leaves the little basin, a cooler current brushes the hull from the right. That means another connection nearby. The boatman follows it, and soon we pass through a narrow slit in the reeds into a more open reach where the water is several shades clearer. This shift is a reminder that the delta's biological richness depends not just on isolated pockets, but on exchange between them. Nutrients move, fish move, water levels synchronize and separate different basins in recurring patterns. A flood may bring river-borne plankton and suspended sediment into a still backwater. Later, decomposed organic matter from that backwater may feed organisms farther downstream when water drains away again. So each habitat is distinct, but none are truly independent. The wetland functions as a whole because it is a network of temporary advantages. One corner may be best for spawning in spring, another best for summer refuge, another best for autumn feeding. That shifting suitability is the ecological expression of an unfinished landscape. You begin to notice that even the birds in view now are arranged according to subtle depth differences. Long-legged waders use the shallower, exposed shelves. Dabbling ducks prefer calmer margins, where they can tip forward over soft bottom. Farther out, divers work deeper water. The distribution seems effortless because the wetland provides such fine gradations. In a steep-sided reservoir, there are fewer soft transitions between terrestrial and aquatic space. In a delta, gradients are everything. A few extra centimeters of water depth, a little more turbidity, a little less salinity, a little more time connected to fresh inflow. Each can favor a different community. That is why this place supports such abundance without looking dramatic. Its complexity lies in small differences repeated over great area. The light continues to fall. Golden reflections turn bronze, then muted copper. With that shift, the surface activity of insects increases again in the sheltered water, and the feeding lines of birds become more apparent. You can almost read the invisible productivity of the wetland by the way they move. A swallow-like bird skims where emergent stems trap swarms. A larger bird waits beside a narrow current tongue where fish are likely to pass. Another patrols a mud edge exposed by the dropping level. The delta offers not one banquet, but many small tables, constantly set and cleared by water. The boatman lets the engine idle and points toward a broad expanse of reeds, trembling softly in the evening breeze. From here it looks uniform, yet that uniformity is one of the great visual deceits of the Danube Delta. Within a broad reed bed, there may be hidden pools, floating mats, deeper channels, old cut-off distributaries, patches of peat thick enough to pulse, and subtle salinity gradients where maritime influence once reached or still occasionally returns. Bird colonies can be distributed according to these hidden differences. So can plant communities. So can decomposition rates and sediment accumulation. The reed sea appears simple only because it conceals its structure so well. That concealment leads to one of the gentler answers to the title's question. The delta feels strange because its most important boundaries are not visible from a distance. Maps can show channels and lakes. They can outline major reed expanses. But they cannot easily convey whether the ground under that green field is fixed, floating, or trembling. They cannot show the seasonal depth of water in a flooded sedge meadow. They cannot show which basin connects to which channel only during high spring levels. They cannot show where brackish influence fades over the course of a dry summer. The lived geography of the delta is richer than its outline. The boat crosses into a long open lead through the reeds, as if someone had sliced a passage into the marsh with a steady hand. The shape suggests older current rather than recent cutting. Perhaps this was once a more active path. Now it carries only a faint drift. That possibility matters, because abandoned and half-abandoned channels are ecological gifts. Once the main current leaves them, they may become sheltered enough for vegetation to advance. Yet they often retain enough depth and continuity to serve as fish corridors, bird feeding lanes, and reservoirs of slightly different chemistry from the surrounding marsh. In that sense, the delta preserves old hydraulic decisions as future habitat. A branch abandoned by sediment transport is not wasted space. It is a new room in the wetland. The evening air cools enough now that the smell of wet mud sharpens. A thin mist begins forming over some of the stiller water in the distance. That softening of the scene makes the seasonal story easier to feel. In winter, certain channels will remain as dark lines between pale frozen reeds. In spring, these same margins may dissolve under floodwater until the distinction between lake and meadow weakens. By summer, plant growth may hide whole stretches of open water. Then, autumn will reopen some sightlines as stems bend and collapse. The ecological richness of the delta depends on these repeating transformations. Species do not all need the same stage. Some require flood. Some require drawdown. Some prefer the decomposition-rich stagnation of late summer pockets. Some depend on winter stillness and open leads in icebound marsh. The calendar itself is part of the habitat structure. A flock of geese passes high overhead, their calls brief and hollow in the cooling air. That sound places the delta in a larger geography. The wetland is local in its details and continental in its significance. Water from much of Europe arrives here carrying sediment and dissolved materials. Birds from wide migratory routes cross or rest here. Fish use the delta as a terminal floodplain and nursery at the end of a huge drainage system. Nutrients entering the Black Sea are partly intercepted, transformed, or buried here. Carbon is stored in expanding or persistent marsh soils, so the Danube Delta is not simply an isolated marsh at the edge of a map. It is a boundary machine between continent and sea. That fact gives even its quietest pools a larger meaning. The boatman adjusts course towards slightly higher ground, where a few willows and low trees break the reed horizon. This elevated line is probably an old levee or ridge, just enough above surrounding marsh to support woody growth. Such strips are ecologically outsized. They provide nesting and perching sites unavailable in the wetter interior. They alter shade and local wind conditions. Their roots stabilize sediments differently from reeds. They also reveal, by their mere existence, how much the delta depends on tiny relief. Where one surface sits only a little higher, water lingers for less time. Soil oxygen increases, different plants arrive. Different animals follow. An almost invisible rise becomes a biological boundary. That is how the delta works again and again. Tiny topographic differences become major ecological consequences. We pass under the shadow of the willows, and the water beneath them is darker, cooler, and littered with fallen leaves beginning to soften in the shallows. Leaf litter from trees enters the wetland food web differently than annual reed collapse. It decomposes on its own schedule. It supports different invertebrates. It changes the texture of the bottom. A wooded margin in the delta is never just a visual contrast to marsh. It is also a different source of organic matter, a different shading pattern, a different nesting substrate, and often a sign of more stable or better drained ground. Because these levees and ridges are scattered through the wetland, they add another layer to the mosaic. Fish channel, reed chamber, mud shelf, flooded meadow, tree line, open lake, brackish lagoon. Each holds life differently. The consequence is not random abundance, but abundance arranged by gradients. The boat emerges from the trees into a shallow bay, where the bottom glows faintly through the water. A group of fish breaks the surface repeatedly near submerged stems, probably feeding on insects or plankton concentrated by the evening calm. This scene, small as it is, carries the whole logic of the wetland. Flooding created the shallow. Sediment helped maintain the shelf. Plants trapped more sediment and slowed the water. Warmth increased productivity. Insects multiplied. Fish gathered. Birds will follow. Cause and effect in the delta is often that direct, just stretched gently across space and season. It is tempting to call such places fragile. And in some technical senses they are sensitive. But sensitivity is not weakness. The wetland has persisted through constant rearrangement precisely because its communities are adapted to fluctuation. A fish nursery does not fail because the exact shoreline changes. A reed bird does not require one permanent patch of ground if another floating mat forms nearby. A migratory flock does not need one identical lake each year, so long as the mosaic of feeding and resting habitats remains broad enough. The system's resilience comes from redundancy and variation, not rigid constancy. That may be the deepest ecological reason the Danube Delta seems so unusual. It is built around recurring change rather than resistance to change. The light fades another degree. Water and sky begin to draw closer in tone. The separate basins and channels are still there, but their edges soften. This is the hour when the delta feels least like a map and most like a process. You can sense water moving under the surface in places where you cannot see current. You can hear birds settling into reed beds that looked empty in full daylight. You can smell the marsh chemistry intensify as temperatures slip. It becomes easier, too, to understand that the unfinished character of the landscape is not accidental. It is the result of several patient forces continuing at once. The river still brings sediment, plants still trap it, peat still accumulates where wetness persists, waves still reshape the outer edge, floods still reconnect old paths, wind still stirs shallow lakes. No final arrangement interrupts these motions. The boatman follows one last broad channel toward a quieter interior reach, not to arrive anywhere decisive, but to let the day settle into the geography it has revealed. The channel is calm enough now that the wake folds away almost immediately behind us. Ahead, The water widens around a bend, and what looked empty begins to separate into faint levels of ground, reed shadow, and pale suspended mist. It is only evening, but the delta already starts doing what it always does, hiding some of its structure while revealing another part. In full daylight, you read it by color and plant shape. Now you read it by sound, by distance, by the way movement gathers in one place and fades in another. A soft chorus rises from the shallows along the bank, frogs taking advantage of water that has held just long enough and warmed just enough to become suitable for breeding. That is another lesson the delta keeps repeating. A habitat does not have to be permanent to be important. It only has to arrive in time, stay long enough, and connect to the rest of the wetland when life needs it. The boatman keeps to the middle of the channel, then eases toward a side embayment where the water is smoother and darker than the main line of flow. The decision is deliberate. Shallow evening water along these margins often reveals the next piece of the puzzle more clearly than an open branch does. Near the surface, insects gather over a tongue of warmer water drifting out from the bay. Small fish flick beneath them in quick silver turns. A bird crosses low, barely touching the reflection with its shadow. None of this is random. The bay held heat through the day because it is sheltered and shallow. Shelter allowed more plant matter to accumulate. Plant matter fed microorganisms and invertebrates. Warmth accelerated the whole exchange. Now the productivity of that little pocket is spilling outward into the larger channel. That is how the delta functions at almost every scale. One place stores, another distributes. One season opens access, another closes it. The larger richness depends on countless small imbalances like this, each one temporary, each one useful. The boat noses into the embayment, and the channel behind us seems to fall away almost at once. Here the water smells richer, more mineral and more organic together, as if the day's warmth has drawn everything subtle a little closer to the surface. Along the margin, the mud is pocked with holes and tracks. Something fed here recently. Something crossed here and returned to cover. The evidence is enough. You do not need the animal itself to understand that the edge between water and land is doing its usual work, concentrating life by concentrating opportunity. The strange quality of the delta becomes gentler in the evening. During the day, its strangeness comes from instability and unreadable ground. Now it comes from continuity. Every habitat we have moved through today is still influencing the next one. The reed beds are still storing carbon and building peat. The lakes are still deciding whether they will favor clear water or suspended sediment. The outer coast is still being shaped by the same quiet contest between river delivery and marine sorting. Nothing stops when the light drops, it simply becomes less visible. The boatman points toward a low, barely raised line crossing the marsh in the distance. It looks insignificant, a dry strip, a change in vegetation, almost nothing. Yet these slight rises are among the most consequential features in the whole wetland. Many are old natural levees or former shore ridges, preserved as narrow threads of firmer ground through a low, saturated world. That extra height may be only a few hand-widths above the marsh around it. But in the delta, a few hand-widths can decide whether roots sit in water for weeks or months. They can decide whether a tree survives, whether a nest remains dry, whether a patch of meadow becomes reed bed or willow line. This is why the future of the delta never unfolds evenly. Water does not move across a blank sheet here. It moves through inherited ridges, old channels, peat platforms, lake basins, and former coastal edges. Each old form biases the next change. A flood follows one weak point rather than another. A reed stand expands across a shelf left by earlier deposition. A brackish lagoon freshens more quickly because a barrier ridge narrows exchange with the sea. The landscape is unfinished, but it is not featureless. It carries its own memory and soft relief. The boat leaves the embayment and returns to the broader reach. By now the sky has dimmed enough that the water begins holding more of the west in it. Bronze near the horizon, pewter closer to the boat. Reeds along the banks become silhouettes. In that simplification, the geometry of the delta grows easier to feel. The branch bends around a low marsh island, and beyond it the channel divides again, one course slipping into darker reed country, the other opening into a shallow sheet of water that seems almost level with the marsh itself. The boatman chooses the quieter course. That choice turns the day toward its next realization. If you watch a place like this long enough, you start asking where the land is. You start asking where the water will linger next. That is a deeper question because lingering determines almost everything. If water lingers, sediment settles. If sediment settles, plants root. If plants root, flow slows further. If flow slows, more material remains. But if water drains quickly, the sequence changes. Mud may crack and firm. Different seeds germinate. Oxygen reaches the soil more easily. Decomposition takes another path. So the future shape of the delta is not built only by what arrives. It is built by how long arrival lasts. The quiet branch shallows gradually, and the pole taps bottom more often. That sound is evidence. This route may still be open now, but not by much. A few years of reduced scouring, a season of heavy vegetation growth, or a slightly different flood pattern could alter it again. That is what makes the delta difficult to finish on any map. Its major branches endure, yes. Its general outline remains legible. But the details that matter most on the ground, the side cuts, marsh corridors, temporary basins, floating margins, and newly raised shelves, are all vulnerable to revision. Revision is not rare here. It is routine. The boat passes a stand of reeds bent in one direction by older high water. At their base is a thin band of lighter material, recent sediment spread over darker peat. That little line is almost enough to summarize the wetland. Mineral matter from far inland arrives. Organic matter from local growth accumulates beneath it. Flood pulses layer one on top of the other. Then roots bind the result into something that may briefly behave like land. Ancient mountains, distant plains, last year's stems, this spring's flood, all of them meet in the same few centimeters of ground. That is why the surface is so young, and yet the process behind it feels so old. The boatman slows to let a broad group of birds settle ahead rather than rise. They drift on the water in the gathering dimness, then gradually separate toward different depths and shelter conditions, as if each one knows exactly how much openness it prefers before night. That simple sorting says a great deal about the wetland. Species here are not only adapted to change, they are adapted to gradients within change. Too much exposure, and a bird chooses reed cover. Too little oxygen, and a fish leaves a stagnant pocket for a connected channel. Too much turbidity, and certain submerged plants fail while others remain. The delta supports abundance because its changes are not total. They are partial, patchy, and recurrent. Some places flood deeply, some only briefly. Some stay fresh. Some feel a little salt at the edge of a dry year or after coastal exchange. Variation is the rule, not the exception. As darkness gathers over the wider marsh, the boat enters a zone where open water lies in long, still lanes between reed masses. The view becomes simpler, but the science beneath it grows more layered. This is the hour when oxygen conditions begin shifting in quiet basins. During daylight, rooted plants and algae can add oxygen to the water through photosynthesis. After sunset, that source stops, while respiration and decomposition continue. In dense, plant-rich shallows, the difference can be noticeable. A pocket comfortable for fish by late afternoon may become less favorable by midnight. A basin rich in growth can also be chemically demanding. That does not make it unhealthy. It makes it dynamic. The wetland's productivity is tied to this constant exchange between light, decay, and water. Even stillness has metabolism. The boatman trails his hand briefly in the water, then lifts it. The surface film clings and breaks in the fading light. You can imagine, without seeing them, the suspended algae, dissolved organic compounds, fine clays, and microscopic grazes that make each basin slightly different from the next. That hidden variation matters as much as the visible one. A shallow lagoon near the coast may have a faint brackish influence that changes its plankton and plant communities. A reed-closed pond may be darker and richer in dissolved organics. A wind-exposed lake may remain more turbid, favoring plankton over underwater meadows. The outer shape of these places is only part of their identity. Their chemistry is part of their geography too. The branch opens into one more low interior lake, broad enough to gather the last of the sky. There is no dramatic shoreline, only belts of darker vegetation and a few pale mud crescents where water has recently fallen back. The mud on those crescents is smooth, with small channels draining from it like veins. This is fresh evidence of a water level drop. Such drawdown is one of the quiet but decisive events in delta ecology. When water falls slowly after flooding, it exposes nutrient-rich sediment and creates shallow feeding zones for birds. It concentrates fish in residual channels and pools. It allows seeds that require moist, exposed mud to germinate. It begins the transition from aquatic conditions toward emergent vegetation on some margins. But if the drawdown is too rapid or too prolonged, other consequences follow. Some nursery habitat disappears too quickly. Some isolated pools lose oxygen or dry out. Again, the wetland depends not on one fixed state, but on timing and degree. This is why the future of the delta remains so open-ended. Its processes are robust, but their exact outcomes are always contingent. A slightly wetter decade can favor more open water in one basin, more overbank deposition along one branch, stronger fish recruitment in some years. A sequence of drier years can let reed beds advance, isolate more sidewaters, and alter the balance between marsh and lake. Meanwhile, the coast is making its own revisions. One outer lobe may continue building outward if sediment supply remains strong enough. Another may be worn back by waves and longshore currents, redistributing material elsewhere. The delta does not move in one direction. It pulses through multiple futures at once. The boatman turns off the engine, not to stop for the night, only to listen. Across the water comes a layered sound. Insects above the shallows, distant birds buried in reed shadow, the faintest hush of breeze crossing dry stalks farther back. The lake itself is almost silent. That silence makes another kind of evidence easier to notice. Tiny particles are still settling through the water column, invisible until they catch the remaining light. The day's movement is becoming tomorrow's sediment. If enough of those particles remain, and enough roots meet them, this open margin may be slightly shallower next year. If wind rises tomorrow, some of them may resuspend and travel elsewhere instead. The point is not certainty. The point is that the delta is always choosing among possibilities through ordinary physical acts. Settling, stirring, flooding, drying, rooting, breaking apart. The engine starts again softly, and the boat glides toward one of the pale mud crescents. At close range, the surface reveals prints, stranded stems, shell fragments, and a fine glazing of silt drying over older organic soil. This is the delta in miniature, a shelf built from a recent high stand, a feeding ground for the evening, a germination surface for some future plant, a temporary edge that will be erased, strengthened, or submerged by the next shift in level. What looks like a margin is actually a moment. The boatman does not beach the bow. He only brings us near enough to see how thin the line is between water and ground. Beyond the mud crescent, the reed wall is not a wall at all, but a graded zone of shallows, roots, and submerged stems disappearing into darkness. You could say the same of the whole delta. It has no final edge, only zones where one process becomes another. Even the meeting with the Black Sea is not a hard end, but a transfer. Fresh water to brackish water, suspended plume to settling particles, river mouth to coastal current. That helps explain why the delta feels so unusual to anyone used to firmer landscapes. It does not respect clean separations. It asks you to think in transitions. The boat moves on, and the open lake begins narrowing into another old channel. Its banks are low and irregular, and in the last light you can see where sections have slumped, exposing peat beneath a skin of newer mud. That layering is important. A collapse like this reveals how much of the delta is built from alternating inputs: mineral sediment from floods, plant remains from marsh growth, then more sediment, then more roots. The ground here is composite time. Not bedrock, not a single soil, but an archive of repeated wetness. One season lays down fine silt, another contributes a dense fall of stems. Years of poor oxygen preserve part of that plant matter as peat. Later floods cap it with fresh mineral layers again. When a bank slumps, the history shows in cross-section. The soft future of the delta rests on these soft pasts. The channel deepens slightly, enough for the boat to settle more comfortably in its own path. This old cut may once have carried stronger flow. Now it acts as a connector between interior basins, still useful, still wet, but no longer central. That demotion is part of delta evolution too. Channels have careers, some branches grow in importance, capturing more discharge and extending their mouths seaward. Others lose energy, accumulate vegetation, and fade into side waters or crescent lakes. The landscape preserves both the active present and the quiet remains of former roots. That is one reason the wetland can seem crowded with hidden intention. Every curve may be a memory of stronger current. Every still pond may have been a corridor once. Every low ridge may be an old beach, levee, or abandoned mouth edge. The boatman raises the pole and points toward darkness ahead, where the reeds part around a wider body of water, not yet visible, only suggested. The route is turning inward again, not back to where we started, because a place like this does not offer return in a simple sense. It offers recurrence. The same water, altered. The same basins, revised. The same reed country, thicker in one place, thinner in another. That is the delta's long unfinished future. It will keep assembling itself from repeated arrivals. Sediment from upstream will continue to come grain by grain. Reed rhizomes will continue to knit soft matter into platforms and marsh. Shallow lakes will continue to shift between clearer and murkier states according to wind, nutrients, and plant cover. Barrier ridges along the outer coast will continue to open, close, or migrate as waves and currents edit the river's work. None of these processes is final. Together they make finality impossible. The boat enters the wider water, and the night broadens around us. A faint breeze presses the surface into long, dark folds. Here the delta feels less detailed and more patient, large again, horizontal again, as if all the day's intricacies have merged into one low, breathing landscape. But the intricacies are still there. Somewhere beneath the surface, fish are moving from shallow feeding shelves toward deeper refuge. In the marsh behind us, oxygen is falling in the stillest pockets, while decomposition continues in the saturated soil. Along the coast, unnoticed in the dark, small waves are still sorting sand at the outer edge. Far upstream, the Danube is still carrying its suspended burden eastward. The whole place remains connected through processes too slow to see in one glance, and too constant to stop. A bird calls once from the reeds, then again, farther away. The distance between those calls gives a sense of scale that daylight often obscures. The wetland is immense, but its immensity is soft. No cliffs announce it. No high ridges define it. It spreads through repetition, basin after basin, corridor after corridor, reed field after reed field, each slightly different, each participating in the same unfinished design. That is why evening is such an honest time here. With visual detail reduced, the real character of the delta becomes easier to feel. Not spectacle, not even mystery in the dramatic sense. More like a continuous act of revision carried out in silence. The boatman lets the current take a little more of the work now. Even in this broad water, there is direction, slight but reliable. The bow responds to it. A cluster of floating stems drifts past, then turns away toward a darker margin where eddy and shelter meet. That tiny movement is enough to suggest how many futures are always being sorted in the delta. This fragment will lodge somewhere, those particles in suspension will settle elsewhere. A fish will enter one connected pool and not another. A reed bed will gain a little more ground along one edge and lose some along the next. Large landscapes often feel permanent because their changes exceed one lifetime. The Danube Delta is different. Its overall process is ancient, but many of its details remain near enough to the surface that you can imagine the next revision before it happens. The boat reaches the lee side of a low marsh island, and the water smooths again. In the near dark, the island seems almost solid, but by now that appearance has been gently undone. It may be rooted in peat, it may float at the edges, its outline may advance in a few years, or split or settle lower if plant growth changes and trapped sediment shifts. There is no insult in calling it temporary. Temporary things can endure by renewing themselves. That is the deeper pattern here. The delta persists because its forms are allowed to change. The boatman guides us into the narrow shadow between island and reed line. The passage is quiet enough that the hull's small sounds return. The brush of water, the soft tap of plant debris, the low wooden response beneath our feet. This inward narrowing feels like the right place to continue, because the farther you travel in the Danube Delta, the less useful broad summaries become. You have to return to particulars. A shelf of fresh mud, a bank exposing peat, a hidden basin warming through the day, a levee only slightly higher than the marsh beside it, a barrier ridge that changes salinity in a lagoon behind it, a flood pulse that opens nursery ground for a few crucial weeks. All the larger strangeness comes from those precise relationships. Ahead, the passage bends toward a darker chamber of reeds and